Welcome, everyone. So glad you've joined us for this very special conversation I want to have with Steve Poskanzer, a friend of mine for many years and a colleague on a board that we both sit on. And I have come to know Steve as a wonderfully articulate person about our current situation culturally and certainly within his universe of university life. Also, attending to this interview is our producer, Brandon Batson. Uh, Always grateful for Brandon's presence. We may or may not hear from him, but I just wanted to alert you that if you hear an outside voice coming in from above, it might be Brandon. Anyway, again, welcome. Glad to have you here. Steve, I think a way to begin is for me to let you tell the listeners who you are, and I think that would be the best way to proceed.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. First of all, it's my pleasure to be here. And both you and Brandon, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about important issues today. My name is Steve Poskanzer. I am an academic and also a lawyer. For 20 years, I was a college president. For 9 years, I was president of the State University of New York campus in New Paltz, New York. And then for 11 years, I was president of Carleton College, which is a liberal arts college in Northfield, Minnesota. My academic area is what I would describe as higher education law. It really deals with the question of how universities and colleges pursue academic values and their missions in a legal and political and policy environment that sometimes smashes into and collides with academic values. And that tension and maybe trying to achieve some productive knowledge and growth through those tension points is really what my scholarly career has been focused on. But mostly, when I'm not being a scholar, I've been a leader of colleges and universities. I started as a university lawyer in the general counsel's office at the University of Pennsylvania, and then moved from Penn to Princeton, back to Penn, to the University of Chicago, to the State University of New York system headquarters in Albany, and eventually I became a president. And while being a president, I've always written and taught on the side on that topic that I just sort of mentioned.
Right. And currently, in emeritus status at Carleton, you are teaching, and among the things you're teaching is constitutional law, correct?
That's correct. So after being president of Carleton for 11 years, in 2021, I stepped down as president. I felt 20 years as being a college president was enough time doing that. And at some level, my really first love has always been teaching and writing. And so I am now back on the faculty as a full-time professor in the political science department. If I were at a bigger university that had a law school, that would probably be the ideal home for me. But in a small residential liberal arts college, which is what Carleton is, we don't have a law school. So the political science department is the right place for me. And I teach courses on constitutional law. I teach a course on the law of higher education, which really, again, is my specialty. And I teach kind of an introductory course on judges and courts, having people understand the judicial branch as opposed to the legislative and executive branches of our government.
Gosh, and it makes me feel that in a subsequent conversation, we could have an interesting dialogue about your interaction with students and their relative knowledge or lack thereof of the United States Constitution and how it functions and how that all figures into our larger cultural conversation.
Well, it's a really exciting time to be teaching constitutional
Yeah,
law right
I
now
bet.
because many long established doctrines and structures of government seem to be very much in play right now. If I do well today, I'm happy to come back on the podcast other times.
Great. Well, and to the point that you are writing, I want to highlight this book that just came out. I just got my copy this week. The University's Voice, Principled Silence and Purposeful Speech. We'll provide a link for our listeners or readers to get their copy hot off the press. I guess it's about to be released, in a week or two? And this is an
November
early
18th.
release copy, right?
That's right. My publisher is Johns Hopkins University Press, and
Yep.
the official publication date for the book is November 18th, but it is available on Amazon.com and through the Johns Hopkins website.
Yeah. Well,
And I'm happy to talk about it as much as you would like, but we can go down in any direction we need to today.
Yeah. Well, you know of my interest in values, civility, and the common good, and kind of engaging that conversation with a not so much with a theoretical point of view, but with an engaged point of view. And of course, you've been in the trenches, engaging these kinds of things from an institutional side. But there's also a personal side on your part as well. In fact, I noticed your book's dedication, and your book's dedication is to Jill and Craig, to whom I owe the highest fidelity and focus. And tell us who Jill and Craig are.
Sure. So Jill and Craig are my kids.
Yes, exactly.
Um, and the fidelity and focus, one of the linchpin arguments in my book is that colleges and universities, as they make their way through the world, and the book is fundamentally about when it's right and when it is ill-advised for academic institutions to take institutional stances on political, economic, moral, and social issues. And I argue in the book that one of the touchstones in deciding when it's right or inappropriate to take stances is to be faithful to and focused on the mission of the institution. And I use that phrase so many times that I gave it the shorthand fidelity and focus. And, I believe that I need to be equally faithful and equally focused on my family. And that's a pretty good principle, starting point for many types of relationships and many types of values that drive us. Certainly leading an institution, it's a good place to start, but I think probably a good place in terms of being a friend and being a father.
Yeah. I highlight that for precisely that reason, that so often the things that matter most get lost in the noise and the mishigash, particularly today with everything coming at us 100 miles an hour, 24/7. And in a sense, what our conversations are about are to try to take a break from all of that and to zero in again on what matters most. And to reiterate what I said when I introduced you is to say you're a perfect person for this precisely because of the things you just said. You connected your family to your institutional commitment to you as a human being, as a man, as a father, as a husband. And all of these things are of a piece and so important to make these connections.
Well, you're generous in your description of me, but one of the
Well,
privileges of working in the academy is there are not enough places in our daily lives and our worlds where there is conscious creation of room for reflection and thinking about core values and how we ought to be making our way through life. And, it is a particular honor to be able to spend one's life and career in an environment that is consciously designed to be that sort of reflective space.
do you think universities are succeeding in that way?
I do. I think universities are always vulnerable. Universities, the tasks that they take on make them vulnerable, make them controversial. But I think by any fair measure, if you look at American higher education as a whole, they are extraordinary institutions. At a time when we struggle to think about in, Ricardian comparative advantage economic terms, where are there industries that the United States has a true international global leadership role? This is one of them. Students, faculty, scholars flock from around the world to come to America to study, to do research. Our universities are the best in the world right now, and we should not take that for granted. But yes,
So,
which
so
is not to say that they do not have very serious problems that we need to address and work to do. But on the whole, any fair assessment of American higher education should lead with the point that I make.
So how do you read then all of the consternation that's been erupting within our culture over
Yeah.
what's going on at universities? I know there's a political, a kind of very focused political piece of that, but in the main, what's going on? How do you read it, and how do you situate the university in that mess?
Sure, there is a current political issue going on, and we can talk about that if you want, but it's better to view this in a larger historical perspective. There is great work that's been done. The Columbia historian Richard Hofstadter years ago wrote a book about, anti-intellectualism in American life. And colleges and universities have always sort of stood either a slight angle to the rest of the world, or I like to use the metaphor, we walk slightly out of step or off kilter with the rest of the world. When you think about what these places are meant to do, it is actually pretty extraordinary that they exist and have been nurtured by American society. Colleges and universities are in the business of disruption. We are constantly pushing back on the boundaries of knowledge. It is the job of a research university to come up with new ideas and new understandings of the world. And sometimes those new ideas, destroy old businesses. Rochester, New York was home for the Kodak Company, and that was a
Yes.
economic anchor of Western New York. And now digital technology, you don't use film anymore. Those
Right.
ideas come from colleges and universities. Colleges and universities also take young people and very consciously teach them to question every verity, every value that they've been taught, okay, in the hopes that they will make thoughtful decisions about what values they're going to live their lives on. But by virtue of what we do, we are a somewhat disruptive force in society. And it is quite remarkable that America has understood that the benefits in the long run of having the creativity and the new knowledge and the bold new ideas and the self-thinking, critical, reflective set of mind habits that young people get by going to university, we have made a decision in this country that those things are worth the price of the disruption and sometimes uncomfortable moments that universities create. That's lovely, and that's a fragile social compact that we can talk more about. But cutting against that compact, there has
Yeah.
always been a deep strain of anti-intellectualism in American life. This
That
is
was my
nothing.
parents. Uh,
Sure, okay? It's lots of us, we know, okay?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
that strain, that hesitancy, that resistance, that fear, that opposition to, the work of new scholars or, young people that question the past, has always been a tension point. It has always made universities vulnerable, and it isn't just about universities. We have seen a sort of anti-intellectual, nativist, hunkered down thread. This is the know nothing party, in the 1830s and
Right.
1840s. And
Right.
the
Right.
darker side of populism in the late 19th century. The populists are great in terms of direct election of senators and, referenda of reform and legislation. But, the populists were also extremely anti-immigration and very
Right.
worried about how America was changing.
Yeah.
This is the isolationists in the 1930s. This is McCarthyism in the 1950s. So if you look at this through a long historical lens, which I think is necessary to, what we are seeing today is part of that larger pattern. The skepticism about what universities do has always been with us, and it is therefore incumbent upon universities to go back and again make the case for the value and the role that we can play and should be playing productively in broader society.
So do you see the current political moment? We don't need to get in politics per se, but the political moment is a populist resurgence against the new thing that universities are, as you said, challenging the culture. Is
Yeah,
that?
I mean, this is
Yeah.
a moment, it is a populist, anti-elitist moment, okay? And, there are an unattractive element of many colleges and universities is this notion that they are elitist, that they're out of touch. All the silly characters of, absent-minded professors and students that care only about themselves. And, these things have been with us for a long time. Like many stereotypes, there always is an element of truth to some things like this, and that makes us vulnerable. Right now, we're at a very interesting moment, and I don't intend to be particularly partisan here right now, but for the last 70 some years since the end of World War II, we made a decision that the best way to fund academic science and medicine in this country was not to create national science institutes and to do this through the government, but rather to partner with colleges and universities. This is sort of what we did in World War II to win the war.
Yeah, it's right.
And, Vannevar Bush and other academic leaders in the aftermath of the war basically came up with a model that we have been using since the late 1940s, early 1950s of federally funded support for scholarly research. Um, right now, that is being questioned in a way that I have not seen a question in my life.
Maybe if
When
ever, maybe if ever, right? I mean,
I think that's right, certainly from my
right.
viewpoint. If we are in fact crossing a Rubicon where science and medicine are going to be more politicized, that is not the province of any one particular political figure or any one political party. Okay. That is not how we have done things in the nation since World War II. I think the bargain has worked brilliantly, as I said before, again, not without flaws. I would hate to see us retreat from that bargain. I hope that it will prove resilient and strong enough. And right now, many colleges and universities are kind of out there trying to make the case to remind Americans about why this has worked so well for our nation and, dare I say, for the world.
So, bringing up the critique that universities and colleges are elite institutions that are espousing a particular political point of view, and you allowed as how there may be some truth to that, but that seems to have reached a fever pitch in our current culture. And I'm wondering how you respond to the critique that colleges are 90% Democrats and they espouse a very liberal, yada yada yada. You know the drill on this. How do you respond to the current cultural moment with that?
Well, the way you respond to the current cultural moment is by doing our job right and making sure that every year we are graduating students who are equipped to, get the jobs they want in a society that values the skills that they have, and make sure that our scholars are producing new ideas and scholarship that is of use to the world. Okay. In the long run, any media campaign, any public relations pitch about what we do, these things may be useful, they may be helpful, they may be necessary, but they are not fundamentally sufficient. Okay. The real answer here is to do our job right and to demonstrate that we are in fact doing our job right. But having made that,
Yes,
you know, use that moral high ground,
right.
um, I think there is always some danger, some vulnerability for institutions because of the way that they operate. These are, quite frankly, elitist institutions. And I don't mean elitist in a sort of social snobbery way, but I mean elitist in terms of some ideas are more powerful than other ideas. Science proves that certain theories work and certain theories do not. We give A grades versus C grades versus F grades. We award tenure to some people and not to others because their scholarship and teaching were not sufficient. At some level, there is a hierarchical, status drawing business that colleges, universities are involved in. As we pursue making the best judgments that we can, however, it is absolutely fundamentally core essential that colleges and universities be places where any idea that is seriously offered thoughtfully as an answer, as a solution, as a question on an important topic get taken with the seriousness that it deserves. If
Would
we are not doing that, we fail. And so
would
the interesting question that I would pose, you're going to say something, Steve, so let me
No, no,
stop
no.
for a
Well,
second.
finish your thought, and then I'll come to it. I won't lose it.
To me, the really interesting question is what's going on in our classrooms. Okay. Do students who have differing viewpoints, let's go right to the nub of this problem. There's a concern often that conservative viewpoints are not taken seriously on college campuses. And the question that I pose and I always worry about, and that I think all my sister and brother college leaders also worry about, is in the classroom, in the scholarly domains, when somebody offers an idea that may be from the political right, that may not be the most popular idea on campus, is that idea going to get taken seriously? Is the person who is propounding that idea going to be treated with thoughtful respect? Are they going to be able to make their best case? Everybody needs to come to the debates on campus with their A game. Okay, you better make the best argument or it's going to get shredded. Okay, but we
Yeah.
better make room for everybody to make their best arguments. The question is, does that happen? And,
Yeah.
That's what we should talk about.
And that requires the faculty being disciplined in that as well. And from a president's point of view, that becomes a kind of tricky matter, doesn't it?
It sure does. And the core of the university or college is the faculty.
Right, right.
They're the ones that do the work. They're the reason why we're here. They do the teaching that helps students grow. They do the scholarship. The job of the president, the provost, the dean fundamentally is to facilitate their work, to make it possible for them to do what they do. That responsibility that faculty have is very heavy. It should
Yeah,
weigh and does weigh
yes. Yeah,
on their minds a great deal. A true scholar always needs to be open to the possibility that all of the ideas, all of the theories that you have premised your entire career on could be wrong. Okay. That work that won you the Fields Prize, that won you your Nobel. Okay. Maybe it's wrong. Okay.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that requires a bravery. And
yes,
it's the same thing is required in the
yeah,
classroom.
yeah.
Okay. You are not there to indoctrinate your students. You are there to teach your students the subject that you are talking about and to help them learn how to think
Did you
and
ever
to
have a situation to deal with like that? I'm not looking for specific,
yeah,
but just in general. Have you had a situation like that as president?
where a faculty member I felt
Yes.
was moving too far towards
Yeah,
indoctrination.
yeah,
Yeah, I've had that situation. Okay. The best corrective for it, quite frankly, is not the president or the provost or the dean. The best corrective for it is your peers in the department. Okay. They know what's going on in your classroom. They know the discipline that you are teaching. In a healthy academic department, first of all, hiring decisions about who you want to have and who deserves to be a colleague should be made with due attention to not having,
yeah.
uniformity of voices and a lack of this sort of intellectual openness and self-critique that I'm talking about.
Would
Okay.
you have allowed a professor to invite Nick Fuentes to campus? Just
I
for our
would
listeners,
probably I would
that's it.
never deny so there's a big difference between public and private institutions here, okay? Public
Okay.
institutions bound by the First Amendment, private are not, okay? But I don't like the idea of denying people the right to come and talk on a campus, okay? So I don't barring someone from speaking really not the way I think you should go. Whether it is a smart choice to invite someone who is an unthinking provocateur, not interested in actual serious exchange, you should be having a conversation with the people that are thinking of inviting someone like that to campus and fundamentally asking, why do you want to do that? What's the point of this? What are you going to learn from this? If the point is just to provoke, that's not particularly interesting. If the
Yep.
point is to truly spark thoughtful debate about race, about conservatism, about ways in which even the university itself is wrong-headed, let's bring in people that are going to have a serious, thoughtful conversation about this. But people that are just there to get attention for themselves, I don't think that's a terribly useful expenditure of time, money, effort.
Think this is a huge cultural problem, especially for people my age and younger who seem to be obsessed with the idea of debate within this like podcasting culture and
Yes.
this kinds of things, right? And that like we should put Nick Fuentes and the like uh, you know, podcasters with no finished degree on the same level as, somebody with the credentials, right? And they're put on the same stage to debate a topic or whatever. Like I just don't see I think we have like we're in the middle of a cultural moment where people are wrongfully placing these ideas on the same playing field, researched,
Yeah.
uh peer-reviewed journals up against the thoughts and meanderings of somebody online.
Let me throw in an idea that may be helpful to our discussion about this, and thanks for jumping in, Brandon, on this. I think context matters tremendously. There are different arenas, different venues for different types of discourse. Okay.
Yes.
And, the First Amendment, which protects many different types of discourse, was fundamentally designed to make sure that there is political discussion in our nation where citizens and voters can make wise choices about who they want representing them and holding their government accountable. That type of freewheeling, aggressive political debate that the First Amendment is absolutely designed to protect is vital and wonderful. But that is a very different type of discourse than what is supposed to happen in a seminar room, in a college classroom, okay? Here, in this setting, there are different rules of the game, rules of the road. My colleague and friend Chris Eisgruber, who is the president of Princeton, just came out with a wonderful book called Terms of Respect that discusses some of these same ideas, and I would certainly recommend it to readers. In an academic setting, we are not concerned with the same type of passion, advocacy, angry citizens shouting and screaming at each other that you might have on the Hyde Park street corner that is about the public political discourse. Here, we are engaged in a very collaborative, cooperative effort where civility is important, because if you're shouting at each other, you can't hear, you can't listen, you can't think, okay? And the type of discourse that the Academy is best at, it's not the only type of discourse that happens here, but the type of discourse that is most central to what we do, is premised upon ideas being offered thoughtfully, being tested, being critiqued, and you have to win or lose the academic argument on the strength of the intellectual case that you have made. Now, in fairness, that's not the only type of discourse that does or should take place on campus. There are late night bull sessions in the dorms. There are, conversations that happen walking across the quad. There are protests when young people or faculty members or staff are upset about something in the world. Each of those things in their own way can also contribute to learning. But the fundamental type of discourse that takes here is different from the broader democratic arena. And Brandon, you talked about another venue. There is entertainment, okay, including political entertainment, where on a podcast or on a debate stage, you try and get people who will clash because people want to see the clash, or they are energized by the clash, or they're outraged by the clash. That's another type of discourse, but that's not the type of discourse that the Academy is fundamentally meant to create.
Agreed.
You know, it's reminiscent of what I felt all from the years we've now experienced with the internet, that we are bombarded with information in which the information bits are all treated as equal. They're all of the same value, even if they're true, if they're not true, if they've been questioned, all of this. So this venue, the podcast venue, the internet venue, the video venue, there are no rules, basically. And so anyone can say anything. And of course, then we all know about the algorithms that take us right down the rabbit hole of whatever it is we click. And so we don't hear any debatable discourse anyway. And the idea of civility is something that is such a important bit of business to recover in our culture. Yeah.
Think so. Although, there's always the risk that civility, can be used as a shield against
Sure.
unpopular or
Sure.
discordant ideas, and we
Sure.
have to fight against that. But you just touched on something I think is very important. We are living in a moment right now where traditional sources of knowledge, places that would authenticate expertise, are much more questioned, or in fact rejected, than ever before. It used to be the case that the New York Times was the paper of record,
Yeah.
and everybody understood.
Yeah.
Used to be the case that you turned on, you got your news from Walter Cronkite on
Right.
CBS or Huntley and Brinkley on NBC, and there were sort of authoritative sources of what was going on in the world.
Yep.
And in the same way, universities were deemed as authoritative sources of expertise on whatever professors were studying or teaching. Now we question expertise. We're all experts. You
Yeah,
can get any
exactly.
information on the internet, and the degradation of traditional notions of expertise and the authentication of knowledge is a threat that cuts absolutely to the potential heart of what colleges and universities are all about, also to the heart of what news reporting and media are about.
Yeah. Yeah. I,
Well,
I
and
yeah,
I find that to be really confusing even for myself, who considers himself fairly well educated and everything, because when you're talking about what I'll refer to as new media, which is like independent forms of media, and that could be well resourced or under resourced or whatever. I think sometimes I'm like, thank God for them because they're not controlled by a corporation or a news media organization that has all kinds of interests. But then I'm like, well, what is the standard,
right.
that they're going by? And so like I even find in my own, bubble that I see as valuable. I'm like, what is the standard by which these people are reporting or delivering information? And I think it's really, really confusing, even for those of us who really value the academy, value work and science and, all of these things.
The democratization of knowledge is a wonderful and good thing. But on the other hand, it has risks and
Mhm.
costs with it. And if one of the risks and costs is the degradation of knowledge or confusion about what is truly reliable or accurate
Mm.
information, we should worry about that. Either
Oh,
you need to
absolutely.
find ways of ensuring the accuracy of information, or you need to find different kinds of authorities where you can trust. And that's really what the academy is fundamentally premised. That's what peer-reviewed scholarship is about. That's what replicable science is all about. We have wrestled with these issues for many years. We
Oh, yeah.
don't always get it right. There's research fraud, there's, sloppy decisions that get made, but at least when you footnote your research, you cite your sources, you explain how you did your work, that is an effort to provide authenticated, reliable knowledge.
Yeah, another aspect of this is that knowledge has become performative. So I can speak out of my own religious universe when I have seen various high profile religious types espousing something in a video or a conversation, an interview that I know to be fundamentally false. And yet the vigor with which they are presenting their case becomes its own authenticating evidence that of course they are right. And it drives me nuts because there is no we've lost the skill set or the reliance on curation. The whole
Yeah.
notion of curation of information and knowledge has been completely obliterated. So because we don't trust the curators anymore, they won't let us speak what we really need to speak, right?
I think that's really well put. It is a real risk.
Yeah.
And we should ask ourselves, why do people not trust the curators? And to the extent that they don't trust the curators because the curators have been irresponsible or sloppy or have not done their curation well, okay,
Yeah.
that's on us.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
physician heal thyself, academia heal thyself. But if it is coming from somewhere else that I've decided I just want to tear down, or I
Yeah.
don't want to listen because I don't like what the curated knowledge
Exactly.
says,
Yeah.
that's a very different problem.
Exactly. And we can't solve that problem today. But on the other hand, I think it's important to lift up that problem and have a lot more conversation culturally, even in these environments, to that particular problem.
Yeah, you
Um,
gotta name it, you gotta be aware of it, and maybe each of us, when we read the news story, when we watch the podcast, when we walk into the seminar room or listen to the speaker on campus, you should always be asking yourself, what's the basis for the claim that is being made here? Is that really authenticated? Is it grounded in evidence? Is there better evidence that rebuts it?
right. And we even see this problem being extrapolated into the AI universe because AI is supposed to be a master curator of information. And yet now we're discovering AI has its uh, own its own issues, so to speak, with the actual truth of the matter, often, not always, but often. It's a curious problem that we've created there. We're looking for a curator, perhaps, and we don't yet have it, and I wonder if we ever will. Steve, just to put a case study also on the whole values dynamic and how an institution addresses, I'd love to have a chat about DEI because that's been one of the principal critiques that's been thrown at universities and has been pushed by a political agenda. But I'm kind of curious how you read that situation. And I'm also very aware that there's a difference between how an institution responds to a particular uh, thing or a value, and how an individual or a collective of individuals responds to a particular thing. There's a tension there. And in that decision making, there's kind of a hierarchy of values that sometimes are in competition. But go ahead.
Well, that's absolutely right. And this is something I spent a lot of time talking about in my book.
Yeah,
My book is focused on when institutions, qua institution,
right,
does Duke take a stance? Does Carleton take a stance? Okay, that's very different from whether or not faculty member Steve Poskanzer at
right.
Carleton takes a stance or student at Carleton Jill Poskanzer takes a stance. Individuals, faculty, students do have both the academic freedom within the academy and First Amendment rights as citizens to take stances on issues that matter to them. Whether an institution takes a stance is very different, particularly because these are communities made up of many different people with wildly different perspectives. I go back always, and this is going to take us into the DEI issue, to your mission. Different colleges have profoundly different missions. You know, Oral Roberts University, Brigham Young University, part of their mission is to ensure and propagate the faith that started that institution. A purely secular institution is going to have a very different viewpoint on issues. A public university has different missions than a private liberal arts college. You got to start with your mission. But the interesting question with DEI related work is whether or not, in the first instance, an institution, after thorough and careful and thoughtful conversation, believes that its educational mission is more likely to be successfully attained if it has a student body that is diverse in every single dimension that you can imagine. Age, race, gender, political views, academic interests, extracurricular activities, and whether the institution also fundamentally believes that when you have asked someone to join the community, that it is really important to try to tap their human capital in the best way by treating them with respect and dignity or equitably with everyone else. Most colleges and universities that I know of have reached a decision that, for educational reasons, to try and achieve the learning and the knowledge and the transmission of understanding that we're in the business of doing, that having a diverse student body and faculty and staff, treating them equitably, including them, that's what DEI, of course, stands for, is consonant with their mission. Is it the driving force of why the college or university exists? No. Okay. It is more in the nature of an essential and enormously valuable means to the academic end. Okay. If this is part of what you do, it is legitimate for colleges and universities to engage in such activity. Now, do you have to engage in this activity in a way that complies with the law and we don't discriminate against someone because that's the law of our nation? Of course. Okay. Do you have to pursue that, the benefits of DEI while also being mindful of whether or not it might sometimes interfere with some of the other academic goals, including some of maybe more overarching academic purposes of the institution? Of course. Okay. But to just blithely say that anything about DEI is bad is too simplistic.
Yeah.
Colleges and universities are often in the business of complicating things that look simplistic. I probably have just done that with that explanation, but if you want to dig deeper, I'm glad.
Well, by the way, did this play differently on a public university as opposed to your private school? Did it play differently?
Plays a little differently, but not fundamentally. Most public universities I know also believe very strongly in the educational value of having a diverse student body and treating people with dignity when they're here. Okay. But public universities are different from private universities in that some of their funding, maybe a large part of their funding, comes from the state or the community that supports it. And therefore, it has an obligation to give back in a way that a private institution might not. And it is certainly politically and culturally more accountable to the political powers that be in the citizenry of the jurisdiction that supports it.
Do you find that
Values don't really change that much.
Yeah. Do you think that universities are stepping back from using this language in the current in our current cultural milieu, or and how are universities responding to the the aggression that's coming at them?
Well, if you live in a state where the legislature has literally passed a law
Right.
that says you cannot have a DEI office,
Right.
okay,
Right.
yeah,
Hmm.
you're not going to have a DEI office. You have to comply with the law. But do your core values fundamentally change? Not necessarily, but you got to pursue those values within the law. You don't have the freedom to
Right.
flagrantly violate the law. Colleges and universities, particularly public ones, cannot engage in civil disobedience the way that, Dr. King or Gandhi could. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be making clearly and persuasively the case for why these values that you have, that you would want to pursue them, and maybe that the law needs to change. Much of the rhetoric that gets used right now talks about illegal DEI. Well, no college or university is going to argue for something that is illegal, okay?
Right.
But they
Right.
should be able to make the case for fundamentally, if this advances the mission of the university, that you should be able to support it. But again, just to put a coda on this, you got to go back to the mission. And the fundamental mission of colleges and universities is to push back the boundaries of knowledge, to transmit and share knowledge to young people or whatever students of whatever age you have so that they can achieve their life goals. Public universities need to be of service to the broader community. You need to preserve the best knowledge of the past. That's why we're here. Start with
Yeah.
that and then think about what techniques, what features, what qualities of an academic community will advance those fundamental mission goals.
Uh, so your book is a very nuanced and articulate discussion of how a university ought to think about whether or not to take a position on any particular thing. I'm wondering if you could give us an example of something that a university should take a position on, uh, as a university.
Yeah, here's a great example, okay? uh, Universities should take a position on core features or sort of the academic freedom of faculty. Okay. For universities to achieve their mission, we need faculty who are willing to be brave and courageous and push on the frontiers of knowledge. If a state, if a law, if a donor really comes to a university and says, I don't want a faculty member exploring that idea, okay, that's a problem. Okay. And for a university to honestly and forthrightly take a position in defense of the ability of scholars to pursue the knowledge and the truth wherever it leads them, that's a legitimate place to take a stance. Okay. Um, is it legitimate for a university to take a stance in defense of something that is absolutely core to its mission? I run a university with an academic medical center. Can I go in and argue that we ought to have more funding for medical research in the United States? That's taking a position, but I would argue that that is utterly consistent with the mission of the university and what it is meant to do. Those would be good places to take mission.
Is there any let's put it this way, any hot button issue that comes to mind, either in the recent past or currently, that you could sort of noodle with a little bit?
Sure, I'll give you an example. There's a law in Florida right now that is being challenged, okay, that, basically does block faculty from teaching particular concepts about race and about
Right,
structural racism and sexism in American society.
right,
And that law is rightly being challenged, and universities all around the country have taken a stance saying that law is unwise, okay? Um, when the country was debating about the propriety of affirmative action in college admissions, it
right,
was legitimate for colleges and universities to say, like I did in speaking about the diversity of the student body before, to take a stance and say, no, there is educational value in having a diverse student body. We should legally be able to do this. DACA students, dreamers on campus, colleges and universities know Many colleges and universities would say that through their actual experience, these students are enormously valuable members of the university community. They do well academically. They add to the richness and the vibrancy and the depth of the learning that goes on here. So to take a position in defense of trying to let there be students to come here, all these things would go into that category. You and I spoke earlier about international scholars,
Right.
the ability to bring folks from other countries to our nation. Again, all of these things are mission related. Fidelity and focus lets you take a stance in behalf of them.
Are universities, do you have like I know this is not right. Is there a kind of union for the universities in terms of collecting, having a collective voice? Is there a way that the universities have a collective voice in our culture?
There is. How effective it is, we might debate in a different way.
Yes, understand.
So there are endless organizations, collective groups to advocate and share knowledge on behalf of higher education. Many of them fall under the large umbrella of an entity called the American Council on Education, which is based in Washington, D.C. But there are subgroups. The research universities have something called the AAU, the American Association of Universities. The public universities have their own organization.
Yeah,
The community colleges have their own organization.
yeah,
All of these groups certainly are strong advocates and sometimes very effective advocates. There's also endless informal dialogue that
right,
goes on.
of
The
course.
president of Williams calls the president of Amherst, who's 50 miles down the road, and they talk about what they might be doing.
Right.
When I was a president, peers that you trust
Yeah,
are one of the best sources of knowledge about how to navigate rather rocky shoals.
yeah, yeah. So, how are you thinking these days about kind of shifting gears a little bit with the role of the university generally and the advent of AI and the voices that are arising that you don't need to go to college and you don't need a university degree anymore? And what are some of your uh, noodlings about that?
Well, we could go on for several
I
hours on
know,
each of these,
I'm sure.
but I can at least provocatively throw out a couple
Yeah,
of
just
things on each
that's
of
all
them,
I'm
okay?
looking for. A little
Let's start about
provocation.
going to college. Not everybody needs to go to college, okay?
Right.
People should go to college because college is going to provide them knowledge or skills or opportunities that they deem valuable, okay? And one of the great, wonderful things about American society that is different from the higher education system in other nations is we don't have a up or out system of doing this. Okay. You know, in many countries, when you're 17 years old, you take a national test, and that national test
Yeah,
determines whether or not you're going to be able to go to college and what college you're going to go to. And that's it. And your life goes on two different paths.
right.
We've chosen not to do that in this country to our enormous credit. So if you are, I suspect that all three of us on this conversation were probably the same type of student in high school. We kind of knew we were drawn to academic and intellectual pursuits. You kind of figured out at 17 that, you want to get good grades in high school and that opens up opportunities for you. Great for people like that, but not everybody's like that. Some people are incredibly smart, but they are limited by life circumstances or don't have the opportunity. And at age 30, okay, they finally say, no is the time I want to be able to get to college. You can't do that in Korea or Chile, but you can in the United States, okay? And through a system of community colleges, there's local access, more affordable ways of finding your way into the educational system.
Yeah,
But having said that, even providing for the broad-based flexible way of getting higher education. Not everybody wants or needs higher education. And if we fall into the trap of not honoring people who are very smart and play valuable roles in our society who don't have paper credentials and degrees, then we're tearing at the fabric of democracy in inappropriate ways.
well,
And
that
we
feeds the
certainly should
elitists.
pay, we're being elitist. And that
That
plays
that
in
feeds that.
to
That's right.
the Richard Hofstadter, and if
Right.
colleges and universities have done that, great example of that's on us, okay? And so talking like everybody needs to go to college is wrong, okay?
Yeah.
But everybody needs to learn, everybody needs to respect others, and colleges have a role to play in teaching that. AI, oh boy, with every vast change in technology in sharing information and ideas, there is always, again, historically, doomsayers and those who grasp unthinkingly at what is coming out as if it's an unmitigated good. Okay.
Yeah.
This is what happened with the printing press. This is what happened with, radio and television. This is what happened with computers. Okay. So now we're seeing the same thing. Okay. Except the pace of dealing with this is faster, and perhaps the risk of getting things wrong in an interconnected world seems greater than it should be. AI is not going away. Okay. It is a tool. It's enormously powerful. And so, to my mind, the question is not, is it good or bad? The question is it good or bad for what? And how do we use this tool and this technology in ways that are productive for society? And how do we limit, control, correct for the ways in which it is potentially dangerous in society?
Are you worried?
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm worried, but not more worried about that than I am about
Something else.
hundreds
Okay.
of other currents that go on in
All right.
the intellectual sphere.
Yeah, I mean, my concern with it is I just think we're so far behind in having the conversation around it.
Yes, we are. I agree.
And I think like it's moving at an exponential pace, and we haven't talked about any kind of regulation or what can it be used for, not be used for. And I was talking to someone the other day, a lot of my friends kind of dismiss it, and they're in that space of being like, well, it's basically eating itself. People have stopped putting good information out there, so it's giving bad information. It'll eventually fade. I'm like, this is what I thought about the
Yeah.
original iPhone. I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't want to touch a screen. I want buttons.
Yeah.
And now I can't imagine living without this thing. I don't like that about myself, but I can't
Yeah.
imagine life
Right.
without it.
Right.
And I was behind on thinking about that and the implications that would have for my life and my job. If I didn't know how to use this, I could not do my work,
Yeah.
And I think about AI in that same way, and how it will impact work, and how it will impact all of us, and how we're not having these very necessary conversations.
It goes back to the point that Steve was making earlier about curation and
Yes.
authentication of
Yes.
knowledge. Okay.
Yeah.
The power of AI is extraordinary. You can read hundreds of thousands, millions of images, search sources that you would never otherwise be able to find. That's great. And we're going to find enormous value for that. The question, though, is as it does that, what is the quality of the knowledge that it is finding, and what is the quality of the advice that it is offering to you? And you are thrown back again into the question of validation, accuracy, reliability of knowledge. Those are timeless questions, okay? But the pace at which we need to come up with solutions, or at least mechanisms for trying to validate or authenticate or curate as well as we can, is, has to be done more quickly and with more urgency.
So on that note, I think I'm noticing that we're coming up on an hour, and I don't want to exceed an hour if I can, just for the sake of my listeners, Steve. And you lived up to expectations. I didn't doubt for a moment that we wouldn't really fill up an hour with a really, really lively content. And you've come through for us on that regard, and I want to thank you a lot. And I want to remind the listeners of Steve's book that has just come out, The University's Voice, Principled Silence and Purposeful Speech. And we'll have a link somewhere where you can get your copy. And Steve, I'm going to take you up on your sort of offer that maybe in the future we can have another conversation or two about so many of these things that we haven't yet been able to touch in our own conversation here. Is there, I'd leave the last word for you. Is there something that would be, that's kind of on your mind within the universe of the things we've talked about that you'd like to say?
I guess I'll close first of all by thanking the two of you for giving me the privilege of being able to share some time and to float some really fun ideas with both of you. I guess I will close by hoping that listeners, wherever they are, will always be willing to ask themselves about, the role that education plays in their life, the importance that they attach to different types of knowledge, and how all of us can make sure that we have the information we need that is reliable and trustworthy to make sense in our world. And hopefully they will see that colleges and universities play an important part of that.
Great. Well, thanks very much.
Thanks for joining us again on Living in the Meantime with Stephen Bauman. You can go to stephenbauman.com to subscribe to the Substack or any of our podcast links. In the coming weeks, be looking for more interviews and longer form podcasts that will be posted to the channel. We'll see you next week.